My older brother thought he could gaslight me into believing our childhood abuse never happened, but he didn't realize our neighbor had documented everything years ago. The manila envelope arrived on a Thursday morning, postmarked from a hospice care facility I'd never heard of in a town I hadn't visited in over 20 years. Inside was a letter written in shaky handwriting, 3 words circled at the top in red ink. I saw everything. Beneath those words was an address for a storage unit, a small brass key taped to the paper, and a name I hadn't thought about since childhood, Dorothy Kellerman. My hands started trembling before I even finished reading the first paragraph. Mrs. Kellerman had been our neighbor on Maple Ridge Drive, the quiet old woman who always sat on her porch with binoculars, claiming she was watching birds. The letter explained that she wasn't watching birds. She was watching our house. She was documenting what our father did to us, what our mother allowed, and what my brother Nathan had spent the last 15 years convincing everyone never happened. The letter ended with a single sentence that made my knees buckle. Your brother visited me last month, trying to find out what I knew. I told him nothing, but I'm telling you everything now, before I'm gone. I'd been living in Portland for 8 years when that envelope arrived, working as a software engineer for a mid-sized tech company, married to a woman named Allison, who knew only the sanitized version of my childhood. According to the story I told everyone, including myself most days, I grew up in a normal suburban home in Crestwood, Ohio. My parents were strict, but loving. My older brother Nathan was successful, a respected pediatric surgeon now living in Columbus with his wife and 3 kids. We weren't close, but that was normal for adult siblings with different lives. That was the story I told at dinner parties, at therapy sessions that never went deep enough, at family gatherings where Nathan would put his arm around me and smile for photographs. The truth was, something I'd buried so deep that some days I genuinely wondered if it had really happened at all. Nathan had spent years helping me bury it, calling me late at night during my 20s when I'd have nightmares, telling me I was remembering things wrong, that our childhood was difficult, but not abusive, that I was conflating normal discipline with trauma because I'd read too many psychology articles online. He was convincing because he was my older brother, because he was a doctor, because he spoke with the calm authority of someone who had it all figured out, and because a part of me wanted desperately to believe him. The memories I did have were fragmented, like watching a film with missing reels. I remembered the basement. I remembered the cold concrete floor and the way sound echoed off the walls. I remembered being maybe 7 or 8, Nathan being 11, both of us standing in the dark while our father's footsteps creaked on the stairs above us. I remembered the belt, the extension cord, the wooden spoon that splintered against Nathan's back one Christmas Eve. But when I'd try to hold these memories in my mind, they'd slip away like water through my fingers. Nathan would call them false memories, implanted by therapists or movies or my own troubled imagination. He'd remind me that our parents had provided for us, that we went to good schools, that we had food and clothes and birthday parties with cake. He'd ask me to name specific dates, specific incidents with verifiable details, and when I couldn't, he'd sigh with what sounded like genuine sadness and tell me he was worried about my mental health. By the time I was 30, I'd half convinced myself he was right. Maybe I had invented it all. Maybe I was the unreliable one. The envelope from Mrs. Kellerman changed everything, because it contained something I'd never had before, proof that existed outside my own fractured mind. I didn't tell Allison about the letter at first. I called in sick to work on Friday and drove to the storage facility address, a place called Secure Keep, about 40 minutes outside Portland. The unit was small, maybe 5 by 5 feet, and when I opened it, I found 12 cardboard boxes stacked neatly against the back wall. Each box was labeled with a year, starting from 1994 and ending in 2005. I was born in 1991. Nathan was born in 1988. These boxes covered nearly my entire childhood, from when I was 3 years old until I was 14, the year we finally moved away from Maple Ridge Drive. I opened the first box with shaking hands and found spiral notebooks filled with dated entries, Polaroid photographs, and cassette tapes labeled with times and descriptions. The first photograph I saw made me sit down hard on the concrete floor of that storage unit. It showed our backyard through what must have been Mrs. Kellerman's kitchen window, and in the frame was my father dragging Nathan by the hair toward the back door. Nathan couldn't have been more than 10 years old in the photo. The timestamp in the corner read June 15th, 1998. Mrs. Kellerman had written on the back in pencil, "Third time this week. Called police. They said family matter." I spent 6 hours in that storage unit, reading through notebooks that documented years of systematic abuse with the clinical precision of someone who had once been a court stenographer, which Mrs. Kellerman had been before she retired. She recorded dates, times, descriptions of injuries visible from her windows, sounds she heard through the walls at night. She noted every time she called Child Protective Services, every time police came and left without taking action, every time our mother assured authorities that everything was fine and we were just rambunctious boys who got into scrapes playing rough. She photographed bruises on Nathan's arms when he took out the trash, welts on my legs when I played in the sprinkler. She recorded audio of screaming matches and worse, sounds that made me pull off my headphones and hyperventilate into my knees when I tried to listen to them 20 years later. By the time I locked that storage unit and drove home, I understood 3 things with absolute clarity. First, my memories were real and had always been real. Second, Mrs. Kellerman had tried to save us, and the system had failed. And third, my brother Nathan had known about this documentation, had visited a dying woman trying to find and destroy it, and had spent 15 years lying to me about the very foundation of my existence. I called Nathan that Sunday evening, my voice steady in a way that surprised me. I told him I'd received some interesting mail and asked if he had time to talk. His response was immediate and warm, the voice of the loving older brother he'd always performed so convincingly. He said he always had time for me, asked how Allison was doing, mentioned his youngest had just started kindergarten. I let him talk for 10 minutes, building up his comfortable narrative, and then I said Mrs. Kellerman's name. The silence that followed lasted exactly 4 seconds. When he spoke again, his voice had shifted to something I recognized from childhood, but hadn't heard in decades, a cold, controlled tone that used to precede the worst moments in our house. He asked where I'd heard that name. I told him she'd written me a letter before she died. Another silence, this one lasting 7 seconds. Then he laughed, a hollow sound, and said, I shouldn't believe anything a senile old woman wrote, that she'd always been crazy, that she used to call the cops on our family for no reason because she was paranoid and lonely. He asked if I remembered how she used to watch us with those binoculars, calling it creepy, saying she probably made things up for attention. I listened to him rewrite reality in real time, using the same techniques he'd used on me for years, and for the first time, I could see the manipulation clearly because I had evidence that existed outside his narrative. I didn't tell him about the storage unit. I didn't tell him about the photographs or the recordings or the notebooks filled with dates and details that matched my fragmented memories exactly. Instead, I said I was probably overthinking things and apologized for bringing up old drama. He relaxed immediately, his voice warming back to its usual brotherly tone, telling me he understood, that the past could be confusing, that he was always there if I needed to talk. After we hung up, I sat in my home office staring at the wall for almost an hour. Allison found me there and asked what was wrong, and I finally told her everything. Not just the letter, but all of it. The basement, the belt, the years of being told I was crazy, the brother who had methodically convinced me that my own memories were lies. She listened without interrupting, and when I finished, she didn't try to minimize or explain or offer solutions. She just held me while I cried for the first time in years, sobbing so hard I couldn't breathe, grieving not just for the child I had been, but for the decades I'd lost, believing I was broken when I was actually just telling the truth. The next few weeks were a careful orchestration of gathering evidence and building a case that Nathan couldn't dismiss or destroy. I contacted a therapist who specialized in childhood trauma, Dr. Miriam Okonkwo, who had 23 years of experience and had testified as an expert witness in multiple abuse cases. I showed her Mrs. Kellerman's documentation, and she spent 3 sessions helping me understand that what I was experiencing wasn't just vindication, but a complete restructuring of my identity. She explained that Nathan's behavior had a name: institutional betrayal, combined with what she called enforced amnesia, where an abuser or complicit party actively works to make victims doubt their own experiences. She said my brother wasn't just in denial. He was actively protecting something, whether that was the family reputation, his own complicity in remaining silent, or something worse that I hadn't yet discovered. She recommended I consult with a lawyer before confronting Nathan directly, advice that would prove invaluable in the months to come. She also warned me that what I was about to do would likely destroy my relationship with my brother permanently, and I needed to be prepared for that loss even if the relationship had always been built on lies. I hired an attorney named Franklin Dubois, a 62-year-old former prosecutor who now specialized in civil cases involving institutional negligence and childhood abuse. I found him through a victims advocacy organization that Dr. Okonkwo recommended, and when I walked into his office with 3 boxes of Mrs. Kellerman's documentation, he spent 4 hours reviewing everything before looking up at me with an expression I'll never forget. He said in 30 years of practice, he'd never seen documentation this thorough from a private citizen. He said Mrs. Kellerman had essentially built a case that Child Protective Services and local police should have built decades ago. He said some of what she'd recorded could potentially support criminal charges against my father if he were still alive, which he wasn't. My father had died of a heart attack in 2019, and my mother had followed him 18 months later from cancer. But Franklin also said something that made my blood run cold. Some of the documentation suggested Nathan hadn't just been a victim alongside me. There were entries from the later years, 2003 and 2004, that described Nathan participating in what Mrs. Kellerman witnessed through those windows, not as a victim, as a perpetrator, doing to me what had been done to both of us, continuing the cycle when our father's health began failing. I didn't want to believe it at first. I spent nights lying awake, trying to convince myself that Mrs. Kellerman had misunderstood what she'd seen, that Nathan had been coerced, that there was some explanation that didn't make my brother an active participant in my abuse. But then I found the tape labeled August 7th, 2004, and forced myself to listen to it. The audio was muffled but clear enough. I could hear my own voice, small and scared, asking Nathan to stop. I could hear his response, calm and measured even at 16 years old, telling me that this was how things worked, that I needed to learn, that he was preparing me for the real world the way our father had prepared him. The beating that followed lasted 11 minutes. Mrs. Kellerman's voice came on at the end, speaking into the recorder, noting that she had called the police non-emergency line and been told that sibling roughhousing wasn't something they could investigate. 11 minutes of my brother methodically hurting me, and the system had written it off as boys being boys. When the tape ended, I vomited into my office trash can and didn't leave the room for the rest of the night. The confrontation came 3 months after I first received Mrs. Kellerman's letter. Nathan was coming to Portland for a medical conference, and he'd suggested we get dinner, just the two of us, like old times. I agreed and chose the restaurant, a quiet Italian place with private booths and thick walls between tables. Franklin had advised me to record the conversation, which was legal in Oregon as a one-party consent state, and to try to get Nathan to make admissions about the past without revealing what I knew. Dr. Okonkwo had prepared me for the emotional difficulty of sitting across from my abuser while pretending everything was normal. Allison had offered to wait in the parking lot in case I needed to leave suddenly. I arrived 15 minutes early and sat with my back to the wall, a small digital recorder running in my jacket pocket, my hand steady only because I'd taken a mild sedative prescribed specifically for this situation. When Nathan walked in, looking successful and confident in his expensive suit, smiling that warm, brotherly smile, I felt something shift inside me. The fear was still there, buried deep, but covering it now was something harder and colder. I wasn't the confused little boy begging for the truth anymore. I was a grown man with evidence, legal counsel, and 12 boxes of documentation that proved every lie he'd ever told me. We made small talk for 20 minutes, Nathan dominating the conversation with stories about his kids, his practice, a vacation home he was thinking of buying on Lake Erie. I nodded and smiled and asked follow-up questions, playing the role of the admiring younger brother he expected me to be. Then, when our entrees arrived, I casually mentioned that I'd been having those dreams again, the ones about the basement. Nathan's fork paused halfway to his mouth, just for a second, before he continued eating and asked what kind of dreams. I described them vaguely at first, watching his face for reactions, then got more specific. I mentioned the extension cord. I mentioned Christmas Eve. I mentioned the summer I was 12 when things got particularly bad after I'd accidentally broken a window. With each detail, I watched Nathan's expression shift almost imperceptibly, his jaw tightening, his eyes growing harder even as his voice remained calm and dismissive. He told me I was remembering things wrong again, that our childhood was strict but not abusive, that I really should talk to a professional about these recurring delusions. I said I had been talking to a professional. He asked who, and I gave him Dr. Okonkwo's name, watching his face closely. He didn't recognize it, but something flickered in his eyes, a wariness that hadn't been there before. Then I made my move. I said that Dr. Okonkwo had suggested I reach out to people who knew our family back then, to help clarify my memories. I said I'd been thinking about Mrs. Kellerman, the old neighbor who used to watch us. Nathan's composure cracked for just a moment, his hand gripping his wine glass too tightly before relaxing. He said that crazy old woman had died recently, which I knew because I'd gotten her letter, but I pretended to be surprised. I asked how he knew she'd died. He said he'd heard through someone, vague and evasive, and then quickly changed the subject to whether I'd talked to any other neighbors. I said not yet, but I was thinking about it. I said I'd found some contact information for a few people who used to live on Maple Ridge Drive. I was lying, but I wanted to see his reaction. Nathan set down his fork and looked at me with an expression I remembered from childhood, that cold assessment before he decided how to handle a situation. He said he was worried about me, that chasing ghosts from the past wasn't healthy, that I should focus on my present life with Allison instead of dwelling on distorted memories. His voice was gentle, concerned, perfectly calibrated to make me doubt myself. But I had 12 boxes of evidence proving that nothing about my memories was distorted, and his careful concern only confirmed what I already knew. He was terrified of what I might find. I let the dinner end without revealing my hand. Nathan hugged me goodbye in the parking lot, told me to call any time, said he'd always be there for me. I drove home and spent 3 hours transcribing the recording with Franklin Dubois on a video call. Franklin pointed out several moments where Nathan's responses were legally significant. The specific details he didn't deny, the way he deflected rather than directly refuted, his admission that he'd known about Mrs. Kellerman's death without explaining how. Franklin said it wasn't enough for criminal charges, especially with our parents dead, and the statute of limitations long expired for most of what had happened, but it was building a picture of someone who knew the truth and was actively working to suppress it. More importantly, he said, it showed a pattern of behavior that would be relevant if I decided to pursue civil action, or if Nathan tried to claim the documentation was fabricated. I asked Franklin what my options were realistically, and he laid them out with the careful precision of someone who'd had this conversation many times before. Civil suit for emotional damage, unlikely to succeed and potentially expensive. Public exposure through media or social channels, effective but personally devastating. Private confrontation with evidence, satisfying but giving Nathan a chance to prepare a defense. Or quiet documentation and distance, protecting myself while letting Nathan live with whatever he feared. I chose a different option, one Franklin hadn't suggested but didn't discourage when I explained my reasoning. I decided to find out exactly what Nathan was afraid of, what he'd been trying to protect all these years, and why he'd visited a dying woman trying to discover what she knew. I started by reaching out to people who had known our family during those years, using Mrs. Kellerman's notebooks as a guide. She'd recorded the names of teachers who had asked questions about our bruises, doctors who had treated us for suspicious injuries, other neighbors who had witnessed incidents. Most didn't respond to my letters or returned them unopened. But 3 people did agree to talk to me, and their testimonies would eventually form the backbone of everything that followed. The first was Patricia Huang, who had been the school nurse at our elementary school from 1996 to 2002. She was 71 now, retired and living in Florida, but she remembered the Aldridge brothers clearly. She said she'd documented every injury we came in with, kept copies of the reports she filed with administration, and had been told repeatedly not to pursue it further because our father was friends with the school board president. She still had those copies, stored in her attic for 25 years because she'd never been able to forgive herself for not doing more. The second person was Raymond Giles, who had been a patrol officer responding to calls at our address between 1997 and 2003. He was 64 now, working as a security consultant, and he carried visible guilt about cases he'd handled as a young cop. He told me he'd been to our house 11 times over those years, always during evening shifts, always finding a calm, articulate father who explained away whatever had prompted the call. He said he'd suspected the truth, but had been pressured by his sergeant to close the cases, told that the Aldridge family was connected, that our father played golf with the police chief. He said he'd documented his concerns in personal notes that he'd kept, against protocol, because something about those calls had never sat right with him. He produced those notes, handwritten in a small black notebook, detailing dates and observations that matched Mrs. Kellerman's documentation almost exactly. Between his testimony and Patricia's records and Mrs. Kellerman's exhaustive documentation, a picture was emerging of systematic abuse enabled by systematic institutional failure, a conspiracy of silence that had protected my father and sacrificed his children. The third person was someone I hadn't expected to find, someone whose name appeared in Mrs. Kellerman's notebooks only twice, but whose involvement would prove crucial to understanding everything. His name was Donald Pemberton, and he had been our family's attorney from 1990 to 2006. He was 82 now, suffering from early-stage dementia, but lucid enough during our conversation to provide one devastating piece of information. He said my father had created a trust in 1999, shortly after a particularly close call with Child Protective Services, designed to protect family assets in case of legal liability. The trust had been managed by Nathan since my father's death, with instructions that I was never to know about it or have access to its contents. Donald couldn't remember all the details, his memory fragmenting mid-sentence sometimes, but he remembered one thing clearly. The trust contained documents that my father had called insurance, things that would ensure no one in the family ever talked about what happened in that house. When I asked what those documents were, Donald's face went pale. He said he'd never looked at them directly, that my father had sealed them himself, but he'd gathered from context that they were photographs. Evidence of what had been done to us, kept not to document abuse, but to ensure silence through shame. My father had photographed his own crimes, and my brother Nathan had inherited those photographs. I brought this information to Franklin Dubois, who immediately recognized the implications. If Nathan possessed photographs documenting child abuse, even historical abuse, he was potentially in possession of illegal material. More importantly, if he was using those photographs as leverage to maintain family silence, he was engaging in ongoing criminal behavior regardless of what had happened decades ago. Franklin contacted a detective he trusted, a woman named Ingrid Magnuson, who had 22 years of experience investigating crimes against children. She listened to our evidence for 3 hours without interrupting, then asked a single question that reframed everything I thought I knew about my situation. She asked if Nathan had ever been alone with children who weren't his own, in contexts where abuse would have been possible. I thought about the years Nathan had spent as a pediatric surgeon, his hands on vulnerable children every day, and I felt something cold settle into my chest. I didn't have evidence that Nathan had ever harmed a patient, but suddenly his choice of specialty seemed less like coincidence and more like something darker. Detective Magnuson said she would need to investigate carefully, starting with the trust documents Donald Pemberton had mentioned, and that I should avoid alerting Nathan to any of this until they had more information. The next 4 months were the longest of my life. I maintained occasional contact with Nathan, responding to his texts and calls with the appropriate brotherly warmth, while investigators quietly built a case. Detective Magnuson obtained a warrant for the trust documents through a judge who specialized in child protection cases. What they found in my father's safety deposit box exceeded everyone's worst expectations. There were photographs, dozens of them, documenting abuse of both Nathan and me over a period spanning nearly a decade. But there were also photographs of other children, neighborhood kids who had played at our house during birthday parties and summer afternoons. Some of the faces were young enough that identifying them might be impossible. Others were clear enough to potentially match against missing persons databases. The detective called me on a Friday evening to deliver this news, her voice carefully professional, but carrying an undertone of something that might have been grief or rage. She said my father hadn't just been an abuser. He'd been a predator with a pattern that extended beyond his own family, and my brother Nathan, who had inherited these photographs and kept them secured rather than destroying them or turning them over to authorities, had been complicit in concealing potential crimes against unknown victims for nearly 2 decades. The confrontation came on a Monday afternoon in October at Nathan's house in Columbus. Detective Magnuson had coordinated with local authorities, and they arrived with a warrant shortly after Nathan returned from his shift at the hospital. I wasn't legally required to be there, but I'd asked to come, and after consultation with her superiors, Magnuson had agreed. I stood on the sidewalk across from my brother's beautiful suburban home, watching through the window as officers explained the situation to Nathan's wife, Rebecca, who had clearly known nothing about any of this. I watched Nathan's face as he was led outside in handcuffs, not for the abuse itself, too old for prosecution, but for possession of illegal material and obstruction of justice in potential ongoing investigations. He saw me standing there, and for a moment, his mask dropped completely. The charming doctor, the concerned brother, the respected surgeon all vanished, and I saw the 16-year-old boy who had beaten me in that basement while Mrs. Kellerman recorded through the walls. He didn't say anything. He didn't need to. We both knew that everything he'd spent years trying to protect had just crumbled, and that I was the one who had brought it down. The investigation expanded rapidly after Nathan's arrest. 3 of the children in my father's photographs were identified through forensic age progression and database matching, now adults in their 30s and 40s who had buried their own memories or been convinced they were false. One of them, a man named Gregory who had lived 2 streets over from us on Maple Ridge Drive, came forward publicly to confirm that my father had abused him during a sleepover in 1997. His parents had moved away shortly after, and he'd spent decades believing he'd imagined the whole thing because no one had ever corroborated his story. Mrs. Kellerman's documentation included an entry from August of that year, noting unusual sounds from our house during what she described as a children's party, and her subsequent call to police that had gone uninvestigated. With Gregory's testimony and the photographic evidence, authorities reopened cold cases from the Crestwood area spanning nearly 15 years. My father's death meant he would never face justice, but his legacy was being dismantled piece by piece, and Nathan was being held accountable for his role in preserving that legacy of silence. Nathan's trial began in March and lasted 3 weeks. I testified for 2 days, describing the abuse I'd experienced and the years of gaslighting that had followed. I described Mrs. Kellerman's letter, the storage unit full of evidence, the slow process of recovering memories I'd been told were fantasies. I described the tape from August 7, 2004, which was played in court over objections from Nathan's defense attorney. I watched the jury's faces as they listened to my childhood voice begging my brother to stop, and I watched Nathan's face as he heard it too, his carefully constructed persona cracking under the weight of recorded evidence he couldn't deny or explain away. His defense tried to paint him as another victim, someone who had perpetuated cycles of abuse because he knew no other way, but the possession of photographs for nearly 20 years undermined any claim of traumatized passivity. The jury deliberated for 6 hours before returning a verdict of guilty on all counts. Nathan was sentenced to 12 years in federal prison, plus mandatory inclusion on registries that would ensure he never worked with children again. His medical license was revoked. His wife filed for divorce. His children, who I'd never really known, were suddenly fatherless and carrying a family name that had become synonymous with generational horror. I visit Mrs. Kellerman's grave sometimes, at a small cemetery outside Portland where her ashes were scattered according to her final wishes. There's no headstone, just a small marker with her name and dates, but I bring flowers anyway. I tell her about the trial, about the other victims who came forward, about the changes in my own life since I learned the truth. Dr. Okonkwo says I'm making remarkable progress, though she cautions that healing from this kind of trauma is measured in years, not months. Allison and I are expecting our first child in the spring, a son, and I've spent countless hours in therapy working through my terror of becoming like my father, like my brother. Dr. Okonkwo assures me that awareness is the first defense against repetition, that the fact I'm so afraid of hurting my child means I'm already different from the men who raised me. I want to believe her. Most days, I do believe her. But I keep Mrs. Kellerman's letter in my desk drawer, a reminder that truth sometimes needs a witness, that someone watching through the window can make all the difference. Nathan wrote me from prison once, a 3-page letter that alternated between apology and blame, remorse and justification. He said he'd done what he had to do to survive our childhood, that I couldn't understand the pressure he'd been under as the older son, that our father had given him impossible choices. He said he'd kept the photographs because destroying them felt like destroying evidence of what had been done to him, not just what had been done by him. He said he'd convinced me my memories were false because he was trying to protect me from the pain of remembering. He said he still loved me and hoped someday I could forgive him. I read the letter twice, then burned it in our backyard fire pit while Allison held my hand. I don't know if I'll ever forgive Nathan. I don't know if forgiveness is even the right framework for what happened between us. What I know is that I spent 15 years believing I was crazy, believing my own mind was broken, believing the person who should have protected me when he told me none of it was real. Mrs. Kellerman gave me back my truth. She gave me back my childhood, as horrifying as that childhood was. And she gave me proof that I wasn't alone in seeing what I saw, even when everyone else insisted I was imagining things. My son is due in April. We're naming him Thomas, after no one in particular, a fresh name for a fresh start. I've already started a journal for him, documenting the small details of our life together. The day we found out he was coming, the first ultrasound, the nursery Allison and I painted together in soft greens and yellows. I want him to have records. I want him to have proof of how much he was wanted, how carefully he was loved, How deliberately we built a life that would never echo the house on Maple Ridge Drive. Maybe that's the real legacy Mrs. Kellerman left me. Not just the documentation of what was done, but a model for how to bear witness to a child's life. She watched through her window for years, recording what she saw even when no one listened, preserving the truth until it could finally matter. I'm watching too now, not for abuse to document, but for joy to remember, building a paper trail of love that my son can look back on someday and know, without any doubt, that his memories are real. Nathan told me once that no one would ever believe me over him. He was a doctor, respected and successful, and I was just his troubled younger brother with a history of mental health struggles. He was so certain that his version of our childhood would always be the official record, that his gaslighting had worked permanently, that the truth was, whatever he said it was, because he had the power to make people believe him. He was wrong. The truth was sitting in a storage unit, patient and documented, waiting for someone to finally listen. Mrs. Kellerman saw everything, and she made sure I would eventually see it too. She gave me back my story. She gave me back myself. And Nathan, sitting in his cell with his destroyed career and his dissolved marriage and his children who won't speak to him, finally has to live with the same truth I carried alone for so long. He knows what happened. He's always known. And now everyone else knows too. Thanks for watching till the end. Make sure to subscribe and like to not miss the next story.